From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. Kim Edmunds, thank you so much for joining me today. You are currently the educational technologist here at the Columbia Language Resource Center. Previously, you worked at Baruch College as a curriculum specialist at an academic support unit for multilingual students. You are also currently a TESOL teacher trainer, which stands for...
TESOL stands for Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages.
And you also taught English recently.
Right.
Let us talk about what I see really as two universes colliding. You know, you're working here at the Language Resource Center, you're working with faculty here at Columbia, and at the same time, your background, your teaching background, your training background has been focused on TESOL, on English, teaching English. So I guess my first question really is, you know, you've been working here at the LRC for about 7 months now, and I want to know, from your point of view, what are some of the things that we're really concerned about in a university context, learning a world language that aren't of concern in your experience with TESOL? You know, just kind of what are your overall impressions?
It's a really good question, and something that I was really interested to sort of fill in gaps in my own understanding, my own knowledge when I first got here, but also realizing that it could be sometimes a situation where I don't know what I don't know. As you mentioned, I've been really steeped in the TESOL world, and kind of one of the reasons we have that broad acronym is because there's ESL, which is Teaching English as a Second Language, which refers to when you're teaching English to people who are currently in an English-speaking country, and EFL, English as a Foreign Language, like, for example, if I were teaching English in South Korea. And the fact that it is English and it's such a global language, for better or for worse, really means that the target goals and the context for use of the learners are going to be one of the main variables that's going to be different. And that's definitely aligned with what I expected when I got here. Especially, we're really focused on supporting students or learners of world languages in a higher education setting. So who are these students, right? What do they want to learn? Why do they want to learn it? Where are they taking it? You know, Are they interested in studying abroad? Are they interested in working abroad? Are they a heritage speaker? Is there a specific community they really want to be a part of or engage in? Whereas compare that with many of my students, I'll speak about my context, right, who have been most recently also students in higher ed. They've been international students. They've been resident immigrants. They're here. This is their community, short-term or long-term. And so there's a certain amount of urgency in their language learning goals. Not to say that that doesn't exist in a world language classroom ever, but there is a certain amount of urgency, a certain expectation from their employers, from the people they interact with, from their classmates, that they're able to use this language immediately and nimbly. And so sometimes that shows up in the way that they approach class. And sometimes there's all these other things that are involved as well. Like, they are interested in learning about the culture. They're studying the language to be more immersed in New York. I find that very common here, especially when you're in New York. So to sort of wrap up this thought, I think the main difference that I've noticed, or one of the first differences that I noticed, is the reasons why the students are studying.
Sounds like the students that you teach here in New York, you know, the urgency is there. They're living in the city. They're needing to interact. They're needing to accomplish specific tasks, sometimes complex tasks. Whereas maybe for your typical Columbia undergrad, you know, learning German or learning Zulu, they don't have that kind of functional urgency. And so you can explore the language at many different levels. You can perhaps focus more on the culture, especially because the culture of that language is not present in their environment.
Exactly.
So can you talk a little bit about an English class that you've taught? You know, what's it like to run the class? What kinds of things do you cover in that class? How does it work?
Yeah. As you said that, I was thinking about how it feels less and less common these days to find a pure ESL class. Really, the field is moving and tending toward, because of demand from learners, an English for specific purposes, or ESP direction. And welcome to the land of acronyms. I'm sure you're familiar. And so the last English class that I taught was at Baruch College, which is part of CUNY. Lots of international students, lots of resident immigrant students. And it was a professional public speaking class for English language learners or non-native English speakers or multilingual students. There's kind of some discussion about the terminology and their identifiers for these students. So my job was to integrate the content objectives and these language objectives. And I actually was on the team that developed this class, for the first time in this context. So I was very intimately familiar not only with, okay, my students need to learn how to make a professional apology, right? Their company that they work for messed up big time, and they have to, apologize in a YouTube video, for example. So I need to help them with the speaking skills for that, but also with the pragmatics of how you apologize in American English, right? What's direct, what's indirect, what kind of vocabulary do you use? How do you structure the rhetoric overall? So, and I also had to support them a lot with vocabulary and with the kinds of texts we were reading, which were business case studies. How can I help them use the language resources that they already have? Because many of them were already pretty strong English speakers, and then adapt those and build on those and learn multiple sets of skills at the same time.
In order to deliver a YouTube apology video for a company in a language, you would need to be a pretty highly proficient user of that language.
Yeah.
I think in the foreign language learning context in the US at a university, this is not a proficiency level that students would tend to arrive at after maybe 2 or 3 years. I think a lot about writing emails in Italian. I am horrible at this, or I used to be horrible at it until ChatGPT came. And there's so many, little rules that are not explained anywhere. There's
Right.
weird capitalization. It's extremely difficult.
Right.
And if you're not deep into that specific culture, into that specific register, it's very hard to learn.
Oh, yeah. And many of my students were, and this, I understand that without some context, this term might mean a little less, but they were quite advanced, highly proficient. And there was still a range though. And so we would tend to be very laser focused on the skills that would help them accomplish this curricular goal. So, let's take a grammar example. There was one where they were role-playing giving critical feedback to an employee. So they needed to learn the kinds of structures that Americans use when they speak English to give polite feedback. Like, it would be great if you could, kind of a conditional thing rather than like, you need to, right? You need to read the room a little bit on that, thinking of an example. But it's so interesting because, and this connects to another, difference that you alluded to earlier, which is that if you're learning English ESL, right, in a community where there's a lot of English being spoken, you have a lot more opportunity, exposure, immersion opportunity. Your growth is going to be faster than if your exposure opportunity and use opportunities are limited to 2 to 4 hours in a classroom a week. But on the similarities side of things, I know for sure that both world language teachers and English language teachers are always thinking about, and English is a world language, let's clarify that, but they're always thinking about how to build autonomy with students, how can we get them using, practicing, thinking about this language outside of class, because that's just fundamentally really good language pedagogy, right? I might have some students, though, and I have had students who they've been in the U.S. for 20-odd years, and they've lived in a community, an enclave, where they really don't have to use English, and they're still really having a hard time. So it also comes down to learners, of course, individually.
Yeah. As a language learner, I loved learning about pronunciation and studying pronunciation and trying to improve my pronunciation. But as a language teacher, I learned that this is not a major area of focus when you're learning a language, even though I personally kind of disagreed with that. And so I want to ask you, in teaching in your English teaching experience, what has been the role of pronunciation instruction or teaching?
So pronunciation teaching is another area in which I am, I guess, slightly biased, or I have a lot of opinions on. The support unit that I worked in at Baruch was entirely focused on helping learners of English or non-native speakers of English use English to be better understood if they had a hard time, aka, being more intelligible. As you said, right? You can speak any language with a noticeable accent and still be completely understood. But the same has historically been rather true in ESL or TESOL, which is that pronunciation gets kind of short shrift. There's less time and resources dedicated to it, certainly in the classroom. The research on that has been basically saying teachers don't have time, and a lot of the time they don't feel confident in teaching it, because it requires specialized knowledge. So one of the classes that I teach in teacher training is pronunciation pedagogy, and I find that my students who are teacher candidates themselves, they find it very interesting, very compelling, really empowering, and then it's the same for learners. I think there's more of a swing toward pronunciation is not just like a fun little add-on. If you build good pronunciation habits early with beginners, it becomes easier for them to be confident speakers. But there's lots of other things going on there, right? Like how a student feels about their accent, who and what they identify with. Is their accent going to be stigmatized? Those are real things. We can't just say, oh, your accent's great, it's fine, and act like there might not be actual things that they experience as a result of it. So my focus has always been on teaching for intelligibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've talked a little bit about your role as a teacher trainer. Can you expand on that? What that job entails and sort of the span of what that covers?
Yeah. So currently I teach one class a semester in a certificate in TESOL. And that's a program at the New School where undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, staff, and then just folks from the community, anybody who wants to enroll, they participate. You don't have to have any teaching experience, but you want to take about a year's worth of courses if you're doing it full time. And then maybe you want to teach abroad, or you want to augment your higher ed courses in art with support for ESL students, or you want to work, at a place that supports refugee resettlement, right? I've also taught in a master's program in the past. That was at Hunter College, another CUNY school. I guess your question is about what they are taught in the programs?
Yeah, just sort of what your role is and the kinds of things that you cover in that position.
So there's, my role has really become the linguistics element of it. Less so the methods practicum, although we do cover a lot of teaching approaches and best practices because we have to. So I really, like I said, I teach pedagogical grammar and I teach pronunciation pedagogy, which means I'm kind of teaching two skill sets at once. I teach all this content knowledge about the system of the language. What's a noun, what's a phoneme? And I also teach, how do you teach this to learners, which is another thing entirely. So, for example, in the grammar class, we use a really practical textbook that is written for teachers. It has a lot of example materials. It breaks down the system of English grammar into some digestible, teachable, learnable chunks that I found to be pretty helpful. We cover about half those things, and I try to teach them a framework for how to explore and investigate new topics in the future, basically autonomy, right? So we're not going to learn everything about grammar, but I'm going to teach you, I'm going to learn you everything about how to explore grammar. If you need to teach something to your students in the future, where do you start? What do you need to include in a good grammar lesson? All those things we talked about earlier. Same with pronunciation.
So if I'm a person wanting to learn how to be an English teacher, I take this class or I take these two classes with you, and you give me two things. One, all the background knowledge that I would need.
As much as I can.
Yeah. And then also how to impart knowledge of English and how to teach English.
Right. Because it's one thing to talk about with my students, a relative clause or a voiceless velar fricative, right? But that's not the language you'd use in a classroom.
Right, yeah.
So it's a challenge for them too, because they have to sort of learn these parallel approaches, and both are equally important. And I tell them because all the materials that you'll be engaging with, if you ever want to use anything in your class, it's going to be using this teacher meta language. But in your classroom, you need to be kind of a translator.
So your students, are any of your students who are going to become English teachers, presumably, or at least they're training to do that, not native speakers of English?
I've had a few. I had many more at Hunter, many more bilingual students, I would say. And my students now, I do get occasionally a few. I had a French teacher. Actually, I've had at the new school, they do offer some foreign language classes. I had a French teacher. I've had a Spanish teacher. I've had an Italian teacher. So they knew a lot of the language pedagogy, but they were interested in adding an ESL. And some of them were very self-conscious and concerned that they weren't, quote unquote, qualified, especially around pronunciation, to bring it back to accents and things. Although I will shout this from the rooftops, you will not find, if you pull any non-native speaker or any native speaker of English off the street and you ask each one of them a question about English grammar, the non-native speaker will know it better. They'll be able to explain it better, because if you don't provide professional training, you're not going to know.
So would you say then that the field is kind of saying, yeah, you don't need to be a native speaker in order to teach English? And actually, maybe even the concept of the native speaker is a little squishier than we might have initially considered it to be, or is commonly understood to be.
Yeah, I like that word, squishier. But no, I certainly think that you don't need to be a native, quote unquote, native speaker to teach English. I know lots of people. I have friends and colleagues who are not native English speakers who teach, and they're extremely good at it, and their students love them. I think it would be naive of me to say that there isn't still a bias towards having a native English speaker, particularly a native English speaker of a prestigious variety, one that's seen as standard, although there is no actual standard, idealized, neutral version of a language. There's just our perception of that, right? But if you have a Midwest accent and you're a native speaker of English, that is sometimes seen as the most desirable.
Yeah, can you expand on that, this sort of notion of language ideology? Mm-hmm. How does that work in TESOL, or how do people think about it? Because when you're talking about, for example, Italian, there are certainly stereotypes or ideas like learn this Italian but not that Italian, learn this fake invented radio Italian but don't learn a regional accent, or don't learn a regional variety of the Italian. And I'm sure for each language, it's a whole different set of circumstances. So what is the state of this type of question in TESOL?
Right. So I read a book in college called English with an Accent by Rosina Lippi Green. Highly recommend. Very readable, very well written. I think it's got a second or third edition now. It was in a sociolinguistics class. And, really it breaks down so well all these ideas that exist out there that you don't necessarily challenge until you're forced to look at and challenge them, which ideas like, I speak proper English. Over there, they don't speak proper English. Or this group of people, their English is not as good as whatever. And that, unfortunately, bled into the teaching as well, where for lots of years and generations, and still now to a certain extent, the standard that we teach is only one variety, one dialect of English, or a limited set of, received pronunciation, American English, whatever you want to call it. But the thing is, there's multiple American Englishes. There's multiple Englishes from around the world. Certainly now more than ever, as it's spread everywhere. One of the first thing I really talk about in my grammar pedagogy class, for example, is this question of like, whose English are we teaching? That's not, whose English is a question that's around in the field. It's not something that I came up with. We talk about, to take an example that's grammatical, right? Let's think about the age-old adage that, we can't have double negatives in English. Well, yes, we can, just not in every dialect of English, right? That's a classic example. And so how do we talk about that with our students? Do we talk about that with our students? I think we should, but then how do we do it is the question. And we always have a really productive conversation. And something that I really like that's very encouraging to me is I've been doing this teacher training for many years now, what feels like many years now. And less I have to convince people of this. More and more I have this conversation, I open it up, and they're like, yeah, obviously, which is great to see.
Yeah.
I think, and it's not just a generational thing either, although I certainly do see like the younger undergrads that I work with, they're much more like already understanding / ready to accept this idea. But overall, it's just been really encouraging to see that trend.
If you think about it, when you learn a language, people talk about the 4 skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So, yeah, speaking is a skill, and that's usually what people associate with language learning. But also listening is a very important skill. And so if you have no exposure to different varieties of a language, if you're in the area in which that language is spoken, you will struggle to understand people. So I think that it should definitely be part of it. Talking about the Italian example, there is a type of pronunciation of Italian that's this kind of neutral or standard version. Nobody uses it. I've only heard one person in real life speak this way, and he was a guy giving a tour of a bank in Siena. And after he gave the tour, all the Italians said, this man is a trained actor. He's speaking, nobody thought that his speech was natural. Nobody thought that he spoke like that at home. So every person in Italy has a regional accent. And if you can't understand these different accents, you cannot function in Italy.
That's something that's so interesting to me because of how globalized and widespread English is. If you learn one of these more commonly taught accents, you're likely to be able to understand a lot of the material that's out there, although maybe less, like an Irish English accent you never heard before, right? But the level of intra-national variation is so, in many cases, like in Italy, for example, so much more nuanced or more diverse than I think I've ever appreciated before.
Yeah, in the US, there are variations, but it's not like huge amounts of variation in a small compressed area like you have
a small
in
compressed area.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So that is relative to listening, but when it comes to a learner's own goals with speaking, when you're in a university context learning a world language, you probably don't have you don't arrive at the proficiency level where that's a huge consideration, that you would choose one regional accent over another. You just never get there. But maybe the students that you teach are thinking about this. And how do you navigate that? If a student says, what accent should I emulate? What should I strive for? How do you respond to that question?
That's another really good question. Usually I'll take it down to an individual level and say, is there somebody out there who speaks English, not necessarily as a native speaker, and you like the way they sound? Emulate that person. Find the people you like to listen to rather than trying to tell them go for this one or the other. One of the challenges, I have these beliefs from my very privileged position, right, about we should be embracing the different dialects of English. But it's one thing for me to say and believe that, and another thing for me to say that to a student who might already be looked at or perceived a certain way because of other factors, and tell them how they should be thinking and speaking. So I try to give them a lot of agency. Yeah. I see my role more as just like, this is what's out there, this is what exists, this is how you should be perceiving. Let's try to break down our own biases around this, and let's also learn English because that's what you're here for.
Yeah. Well, I like that answer also, because if you really love a particular actor or public figure, then that's motivating too. You want to listen to them speaking, and you want to inhabit their way of being too. Yeah. It's fun to do that.
Something that reminds me of, and this come up a little bit already in the conversation, but another big difference between TESOL and world language teaching is, depending on the language, the availability and breadth and type of materials and authentic material. There's just sometimes an overwhelming amount of English language content out there. But, we were just having this conversation with, our Wolof instructor here, Mariam, she was saying, I'm so jealous of these languages who could use AI to produce material, because there just isn't enough data for it to be trained on to produce useful. And that really shows two things, right? It shows there's not enough data, resources, authentic materials already, and that gap is going to be widening because of the fact that these AI tools can't add onto it. We're kind of in a weird feedback loop here.
Right, where languages that have huge corpora of text that are digital, like English or Chinese, have these, super advanced AIs, whereas a language that doesn't have that, the AI version of that is just poorly translated, just a mess.
Another thing that I've noticed, in working with many of the faculty here is that they start, not necessarily start, but their projects, their goals, right, is to create material in these languages, because there's just none, and they want to share it with the wider community. Like Rakesh, for example, Ranjan, who teaches Hindi here, making these fantastic repositories of authentic, semi-authentic material. That's something that with ESL, I would be more inclined. Like if I had a project I had to make, would be like, how do I organize this stuff? How do I select this stuff? Rather, not so much how do I create this stuff? You know what I mean?
So to kind of boil it down and try to understand at a very basic level the differences between world language teaching in the US and TESOL, ESL, from what you're saying, and I want to know if you agree with this, the biggest difference is the context. The context, the motivation, the reason for learning the language and what you're going to do with it.
Right.
And the overarching pedagogical principles are generally the same. It's just that if you're learning English either in the US or in another country, you have maybe a different set of parameters than you would if you're learning world language in the US.
I think so. I think that's what I see to be accurate. I'm still learning a lot about world language teaching in the U.S. and I'm observing classes here and talking to the instructors and talking to you and my other colleagues here. But I think that sums it up, right? The principles of second language acquisition, teaching, they are what they are across the language. But I think that in an ESL context, you might be executing those things differently because of what kinds of resources, material, opportunity your students have to be exposed to the language, and that might be very different. But also motivation, as you mentioned, target learning use. And then there was something else that I wanted to mention, and this is more of a question, really. I wonder to what extent a world language teacher in the U.S. feels very uniquely responsible for conveying cultural knowledge as well. Certainly that's part of an ESL curriculum, but I think it might receive a little less focus because you can just be like, all right, go out and get your cultural experience and I'll see you next week.
Yeah. I think it's kind of evolved over time. There's been, since I guess the communicative era, the idea that a language teacher has to manifest a whole culture inside the space of the classroom. And as soon as you cross the threshold from the classroom, it ceases to exist. And that's really a huge role that technology has played in creating that. Sure, you can bring in some realia, you can bring in some items from the target culture, but, using technology to convey that culture has, I think it was really like the responsibility of the teacher. But now, as technology has evolved and also as the field of language pedagogy has evolved, I think that responsibility of entering the culture is more and more on the side of the learner, tracing their own independent pathway through a language and culture using technology, or engaging with texts in a much deeper way than perhaps had been done previously. Text construed not just as a printed text, but as perhaps visual text or multi-layered texts that are, multimodal in nature. And so, I think it's better that way because through technology, we can experience many facets of a different culture in the same way that the members of that culture experience them too, in this mediated form.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's been a way in which world language teaching has begun to get a little closer to the practices of TESOL and ESL in the US, and that the culture itself is a little closer, more proximal than it had been previously.
Oh, that's so interesting. I would say that makes complete sense. Who was it? I think it was João Nemineto in Portuguese was talking about how sometimes his students will come in and just already have all these ideas about Portuguese speaking influencers, or, one of the richest texts that I've ever delved into in Korean, which is a language that I have very minimal, knowledge of, is YouTube comments,
Yeah,
and I'm
yeah.
really motivated to understand those, for example.
But you reading a YouTube comment is the same thing that a person in Korea reading a YouTube comment would also do. So we're experiencing the culture in the same way,
Right.
at least in the same sort of medium, not necessarily in the same set of feelings or understandings. But yeah, I think that technology has that really beneficial role.
Yeah.
Of course,
absolutely.
technology has some negatives, but I think
Yeah.
for language learning, it can really be a huge benefit.
I personally think that, especially with when you're teaching younger generations, right? We're still teaching all people everywhere, but specifically in an institution like this, I think it's technology and how to use it can and often should be a more bottom up rather than top down endeavor. I think we want to be looking at, for the reasons you mentioned, what are our students already using? What are they doing? What comes naturally to them? And how can we then spin that into something that will help them learn this language? Yeah.
Well, Kim, I propose that we have a part 2 of this conversation at a future time where we delve in more to this topic, both technology and also AI.
Great.
And how that relates to TESOL and ESL versus world language teaching. But for now, let us press the pause button and then pick it up at another time. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
That sounds great. Thanks for having me.